Hello, everyone. My name's Christian Saint-Pierre, and today I wanted to talk a little bit about something fun and a little bit quirky and interesting, and that is the 10,000 things. So, the 10,000 things are often seen sort of as a mystical number in Chinese cosmology and Taoism. In fact, the Tao Te Ching actually refers to the 10,000 things when it says, the Tao generates the 1 generates the 2 generate the 3 generate the 10,000 things. And this is meant to represent sort of the evolution of complexity. So the 1 is essentially Wu Ji, okay, where there is a grand unity, if you will. And then the 1 splits into Huangji, or the 2. Okay, we have yin and yang. And then the Huangji splits into the Taiji. So the Taiji is yin and yang and their interactions with one another. Now, from the Taiji, we actually can split it into Tai Yang and Tai Yin. So, meaning that we have one part of the Taiji which is completely Yang, and one part of the Taiji which is completely Yin. We call it Great Yang and Great Yin. But these little dots, right, they mean that nothing is absolute. So this Yang here and this Yin actually can be further subdivided. And so then we have Tai Yang, or Great Yang, and Xiao Yang, or Little Yang. And we have Tai Yin, or Great Yin, and Xiao Yin, or Little Yin. And as soon as we have this, we have a Huangji, which means that from the Huangji, of course, comes the Taiji, which means that we can further subdivide each of these. And so we start to see this exponential subdivision, or this exponential evolution of complexity, right? Where the yin can be further divided into yin and yang, and then each division can be further divided into yin and yang. And for the yang, it can be divided into yin and yang, and then each one can be further divided into yin and yang. And those, of course, can then further be divided and further be divided. So we have this essentially almost an infinite fractal of subdivision, or of divisions into smaller and smaller sections. And if we remove the sort of the Taiji symbolism and we just explore what's happening, then we could see that we have what's called a fractal canopy, or an infinitely divisible sort of fractal tree, which ends up emerging in the direction of the yin and in the direction of the yang, right? So the yang is divided into yin and yang, and then each of those divisions is further divided into yin and yang, and so on and so forth. Every time it splits and it splits and it splits. And the same thing with the yin. So extending this outwards, we end up with the concept of one wu, or the 10,000 things. So we have Taiji, right, which then basically cascades into all of the different phenomena of the universe, the 10,000 things. And the 10,000 things, therefore, are meant to be innumerable or uncountable, infinite. And essentially, this is what the 10,000 things is meant to represent: the uncountable, infinite complexity, right, that emerges from Taiji. But why 10,000? I mean, why couldn't they have said a million, or why didn't they say 100,000, or why 10,000? That is the question. And I came across an interesting answer by chance, actually, because I've actually been researching Chinese hand mnemonics for Chinese calendrics. In other words, figuring out stems and branches through hand uh, methods, through calculating on the hands what the stem and the branch of the hour are, and so on and so forth. And I also recently have been teaching my daughters how to use an abacus. And these two things together actually brought about a very interesting answer to the question of the 10,000 things. So, Chinese hand numbers, some people might be familiar with them. Okay, we have different ways of representing the numbers using hand representations, and sort of this is almost a cultural icon of China. You can use one hand to represent all 10 numbers using this particular method. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, and then 5, of course, and then 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10. And these are ways of representing the numbers that are actually not meant to do any kind of calculations. These are actually meant to communicate numbers to another person. So when you are talking with another person, you actually can throw these hand signs and actually clearly explain which numbers you are talking about. Now, there are regional differences. So, for instance, in Taiwan, some of these numbers are different. The number 8 is done differently. I think the number 5 is done differently. In northern China, the number 5 can be represented simply with the thumb. So a closed fist and just extending the thumb. This is very important for later. But the general idea of this kind of a hand numbering system is that it's meant to communicate numbers. It's not meant to do any kind of calculation. But there are hand numbering systems that are meant for calculation. Here is one of them. So we have 10 numbers that are represented by the hands, but it's a little bit different than what we would generally think of when we're counting up to 10 on both hands. And there's a reason for this, and that's because of sort of the abacus system. Now, whether or not the abacus system or the hand system came first, I'm not going to get into that, but there's a definite link between the two, and I'm going to show you what that is. So this is a Chinese abacus, and people tend to think that this is the original abacus, okay? And it's got 5 beads on the bottom and 2 beads on the top. But this is actually not the original, the oldest abacus of China. This is actually a Ming Dynasty abacus. Older versions actually existed, where during, for instance, the Song Dynasty, there was 1 bead on the top and 5 beads on the bottom. And even earlier, during the Han Dynasty, we had an abacus where there was 1 bead on the top and 4 beads on the bottom. And this Han Dynasty style actually continued and flourished in Japan. And so this is actually the current format for a Japanese abacus. It's called a Japanese soroban. So how does an abacus work? Well, it's quite simple. So you have this beam right here which is separating the bottom beads from the top beads. And any time a bead is touching this beam, that means you are expected to count that bead and to make sense of it. So, for instance, here we have 1 bead which is touching the bar, and we would count this as 1. Now we have 2 beads touching the bar, and we would count this as 2. Now we have 3 beads touching, so that's 3. 4 beads touching, that's of course 4. And now we have no more beads left. We can't add another bead on the bottom to make 5, so how do we represent 5? Well, we take these 4 beads and replace them with the top bead, 5. Then we can add another bottom bead for 6, and then we can add 2 beads to the 5 for 7, 8, and 9. And now, of course, we have no more beads to add. So what we can do is we can add a bead, but replace all of these beads with 1 bead in the next column. And so now we have 10. This represents 10. And this continues on. So we can represent very large numbers with the abacus, of course, but the same principle follows from column to column. So if we wanted to represent the number 2019, for instance, then we would have 2 beads touching in the thousands column. We would have no beads touching in the hundreds column. We would have 1 bead touching in the tens column, and we would have the 9 here, the 1 5 plus 4 singles touching in the ones column. So this is 2 0 1 9. Okay, so a fairly straightforward way of using an abacus. Now, what does this have to do with the 10,000 things? Well, it turns out that the abacus has a very strong connection to hand calculation. So when you place your 2 hands beside an abacus, you'll notice that we have above the beam, we have columns which each have 1 bead. And then below the beam, the columns all have 4 beads. Just like our hands, we have 1 thumb and we have 4 fingers. And so what we can do then is we can actually use both of our hands to represent numbers in the same way as the abacus represents numbers. So the number 1 is represented by 1 finger. The number 2 by 2 fingers. The number 3 by 3 fingers. The number 4 by 4 fingers, of course. But now the number 5 is represented by replacing the 4 beads with the number 5 bead at the top. And so we replace our 4 fingers with our thumb. And again, in northern China, this actually represents the number 5 in some regions. Then if we wanted to do 6, then we can add another finger. 7, 8, right? 5, 6, 7, 8. And 9. 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Now, to replace those 9 beads, if we wanted to add 1 to them, right, because we can't add any more beads here, then we replace them with 1 bead from the tens column, and we replace this entire hand with 1 finger from the other hand. So the finger of the left hand represents 10, right? 1 value of 10. So if we wanted to represent, for instance, the number 64, then the left hand would have a 5 bead, which is represented by the thumb, and a 1 bead, represented by the index finger. So for a total of 6, right? And because this is in the tens column, this is 60. And we would have 4 in the ones column, so 1, 2, 3, 4. And that would represent 64. Now, we can also represent larger numbers, such as 100. So the number 100 is represented on the right hand with a single knuckle. So you basically hold up a half finger, if you will, by just raising the knuckle up like this. And that represents 100. And by having a hooked finger, like so, you can actually represent the number 100 and the number 1 at the same time. So this actually represents 101 right here. Likewise, on the left hand, a knuckle represents 1,000 as opposed to 10, right? An index finger represents 10 on the left hand, but just a knuckle represents 1,000. And if we hook it like this, then that also represents 1,000 because it's hooked, but it also represents 10. So this represents 1,010 on the left hand. Now, on the left hand, a raised thumb represents 50, okay, because one thumb represents one bead of 5 in the tens column. But if we hook it like so, then we are representing both by just the knuckle, we're representing 5,000, and the hooked nature of it, we're also representing 50. So a hooked thumb represents 5,050 on the left hand. So if we're looking at both hands together, then we have here a way of representing very large numbers. So on this hand, on the right hand, we have a 5 represented by the thumb, and we have 2 knuckles up here, so that's 100, 200, and we have this hooked finger here, so that's 100 plus a 1. So we have 100, 200, 300, and we have a 5 and a 1, so if that's 6, so it's 306 is represented on the right hand right now. And on the left hand, we have 2 knuckles up, so 1,000, 2,000, and we also have a 10 being represented by this hooked finger. So that is 2,010. So in total, we have 2,000 here, 300 here, plus a 10 here, plus a 6 here. So 2,316 is being expressed by these two hands. Now, what do you think this means, this particular setup? All fingers are extended, all fingers are hooked. That means all fingers we're basically representing as much information as we can in this system with these two hands. And it turns out that this actually represents 9,999. Okay, so on this side we have 5,050, 6,060, 7,070, 8,080, 9,090. Okay, here we have 505, 606, 707, 808, 909. So 9,090 plus 909 gives us 9,999. The maximum value that can be represented on two hands using this abacus system. 10,000 is not countable on this hand system. And this is why 10,000 is meant to represent the uncountable and the infinite, because you cannot count it on two hands in this system. So the 10,000 things, whenever we mention the 10,000 things, it is meant to represent the uncountable, the infinite. And why do we use 10,000? Well, because in this hand numbering system, 10,000 is the first number that is uncountable. So the 10,000 things is infinity, and this is the mundane reason why. Yes, it's a mystical number representing infinity, but at the same time, the number 10,000 comes from a very practical and mundane sort of source. So that's it. Nothing too crazy about this. I just thought it was interesting and fun, and I wanted to share it with you. So thanks for watching, and I'll talk to you guys again some other time. Bye now.